There is a kind of power in this world that does not announce itself with noise, nor does it beg to be seen. It walks quietly, sits calmly, and listens more than it speaks. But do not mistake its silence for weakness. For there are people among us who have learned a sacred truth, that the moment you understand your own worth, you become a force that cannot be bent, bought, or broken. They do not argue to prove their value, nor do they chase approval to feel whole. Instead, they move with a stillness that unsettles those who seek control, because you cannot command a soul that has already chosen itself. Today, we step into the quiet, unshakable habits of those rare individuals, the ones who cannot be controlled. There is a quiet strength that lives within certain souls, a strength that does not need permission to exist, and does not wait for applause to be felt. It is not the kind that storms into a room demanding attention, but rather the kind that settles gently, like morning light, steady and undeniable. These individuals have come to know themselves in ways the world cannot easily touch. They have sat with their fears, listened to their doubts, and still chose to stand in their truth. And in that knowing, they have discovered that power is not something you perform, it is something you become. You see, when a person begins to understand their own heart, when they recognize the rhythm of their own worth, something shifts quietly within them. They are no longer swayed by every passing opinion or shaken by every raised voice. The world may try to label them, to measure them, to define them, but they have already done the work of defining themselves. And so they move differently, not with arrogance, but with a calm certainty that does not need to prove itself. They understand that not every battle deserves their energy, and not every voice deserves their attention. There is a deep peace that accompanies this kind of self-awareness. It is the peace of knowing that you do not have to shrink to be accepted, nor stretch yourself thin to be loved. It is the quiet assurance that you are enough, even in your stillness. And from that place, their decisions are no longer driven by fear or the need to please others. Instead, they are guided by a steady inner compass that points them toward truth, even when the path is lonely. This peace becomes their anchor, holding them steady when the world grows loud and uncertain. And because they have made peace with who they are not easily controlled. You cannot manipulate someone who has already faced their own shadows. You cannot intimidate someone who no longer seeks validation outside of themselves. Their strength is not loud, but it is unshakable. It shows itself in the way they remain calm in chaos, in the way they choose silence over unnecessary conflict, and in the way they walk away from anything that disturbs their inner balance. So while the world may celebrate the loudest voices and the boldest displays, there is something far more powerful happening beneath the surface. There are people who are building themselves quietly, patiently, and intentionally. And in that quiet, they are becoming something the world cannot easily control, because they have already learned to stand firmly within themselves. There is a powerful difference between a life that reacts and a life that responds, and those who cannot be controlled have learned to live inside that difference. They understand that not every emotion deserves expression, and not every moment requires an immediate answer. Where others may be quick to anger, quick to defend, or quick to speak, they pause, and in that pause, they reclaim something many people unknowingly give away: their power. For when you react without thought, you hand over control to whatever provoked you. But when you respond with intention, you remind the world that you belong to yourself. These individuals have felt the pull of anger, the sting of disrespect, the heat of frustration, yet they do not allow those feelings to drive them blindly. They sit with their emotions, not as enemies, but as messengers. They listen, they breathe, and they choose. That choice is where their freedom lives. It is not that they feel less than others. It is that they have learned not to be ruled by what they feel in a passing moment. They know that a single reaction, spoken in haste, can build walls that take years to break down. And so they guard their words, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. There is a quiet discipline in this way of living. It requires patience in a world that rewards immediacy. It requires strength in moments when it would be easier to lash out. But they have come to understand that losing control of your emotions is often the first step toward losing control of your direction. So they slow themselves down. They allow the storm to pass before they decide how to move. And in doing so, they remain steady while others are carried away by every shifting wind. You will notice that they do not engage in every argument, nor do they feel the need to defend themselves against every misunderstanding. It is not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that some battles are designed to drain, not to resolve. They choose their responses carefully, knowing that silence can be more powerful than noise, and calmness can be more disarming than anger. Their restraint is not weakness, it is mastery. And this mastery makes them difficult to control. For manipulation often feeds on emotional impulsiveness. It seeks quick reactions, unguarded words, and unexamined feelings. But when a person takes the time to respond rather than react, that doorway closes. They cannot be easily provoked nor easily steered by others' intentions. They stand firm, not because the world is gentle with them, but because they have learned to be steady within themselves. In the end, their power lies not in suppressing emotion, but in transforming it. They feel deeply, but they act wisely. And in that balance, they create a life that is not dictated by circumstance, but shaped by conscious choice. There is a sacred kind of silence that not everyone understands. It is not the silence of weakness, nor the silence of fear, but the silence of those who have learned that not every voice deserves an answer. These individuals have discovered that constantly explaining themselves is a quiet form of surrender, a slow giving away of energy to people who may never intend to understand. And so they choose stillness. They let their actions speak where words would only be wasted, and they rest in the truth that their worth does not need to be defended at every turn. They have come to see that the world is filled with noise, opinions thrown carelessly, judgments made too quickly, and expectations placed without permission. And if one is not careful, they can spend a lifetime responding to it all, trying to correct every misunderstanding, trying to prove every truth. But those who cannot be controlled step away from that exhausting cycle. They understand that clarity does not always come from explanation, and respect does not always follow justification. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the one left unspoken. There is strength in knowing when to speak, but there is even greater strength in knowing when not to. These individuals do not rush to fill every silence, nor do they feel the need to defend every decision. They have learned that people will hear what they are ready to hear, not always what is being said. And so, instead of chasing validation through endless words, they protect their peace through quiet confidence. Their silence is not emptiness, it is fullness, a space where their energy is preserved rather than drained. You will notice that they do not argue to convince those who are committed to misunderstanding them. They do not bend themselves into explanations for those who have already chosen their version of the story. Instead, they step back. They allow others to think what they will, knowing that truth does not lose its power simply because it is not loudly defended. This kind of silence unsettles those who seek control, because control often depends on reaction, on engagement, on pulling someone into a web of words and emotions. But when there is no response to grasp onto, that control begins to fade. And in that quiet, they become untouchable in a way that is not harsh, but deeply rooted. They are not easily provoked, not easily drawn into unnecessary conflict, not easily drained by the demands of others. Their silence becomes a boundary, one that does not need to be announced to be respected. It is felt in the way they withdraw from chaos, in the way they choose peace over proving a point, and in the way they hold their energy as something valuable, not to be spent on every passing moment. In the end, their silence is not about shutting the world out, but about choosing what deserves to come in. It is a quiet declaration that their time, their energy, and their spirit are not available for constant explanation. And in protecting that space, they protect themselves, becoming steady, grounded, and beyond the reach of those who rely on noise to control what was never theirs to command. There comes a moment in a person's life when they realize that saying yes to everything is, in truth, a quiet betrayal of themselves. It is not always loud or obvious, this betrayal. Sometimes it hides in polite smiles, in reluctant agreements, in the soft surrender of one's own needs just to keep the peace. But those who cannot be controlled have faced this truth, and they have chosen differently. They have learned that every yes given out of guilt is a piece of their freedom slowly slipping away, and so they begin to reclaim it, one honest no at a time. For them, no is not a weapon, nor is it an act of defiance. It is a declaration of self-respect. It is the quiet understanding that their time, their energy, and their spirit are valuable, and not everyone is entitled to it. They do not dress it up in long explanations or soften it until it loses its meaning. They speak it simply, clearly, and without apology. And in doing so, they teach others how to treat them, not through force, but through consistency. Because a boundary spoken with uncertainty invites challenge, but a boundary spoken with calm conviction stands firm on its own. This way of living is not always easy. The world has a way of rewarding compliance and questioning refusal. People may misunderstand, may push back, may even attempt to make them feel guilty for choosing themselves. But those who cannot be controlled have learned to sit comfortably in that discomfort. They understand that disappointment is not the same as harm, and that someone else's reaction is not always their responsibility to carry. So they stand, even when their voice trembles, even when the room grows quiet around their decision. There is a deep courage in refusing to shrink for the comfort of others. It is the courage to be seen as firm, to be labeled as distant, to be misunderstood, and yet remain true. These individuals no longer measure their worth by how much they can give or how much they can endure. Instead, they measure it by how honestly they can live. And honesty, at times, requires refusal. It requires turning away from what drains them, even when it would be easier to stay and please. You will notice that they do not argue endlessly to justify their boundaries. They do not chase after approval once they have made their decision. They understand that a boundary is not a request, it is a choice. And once that choice is made, it does not need to be defended again and again. This quiet certainty unsettles those who seek control, because control often depends on access, unlimited, unquestioned access. But when someone begins to choose when, where, and how they show up, that access is no longer guaranteed. And so they become steady in a way that cannot be easily shaken. They give when it is genuine, they step back when it is necessary, and they do so without carrying the heavy weight of guilt. Their no is not a rejection of others, it is a commitment to themselves. And in honoring that commitment, they build a life that is not shaped by pressure, but by intention. One boundary, one choice, one quiet act of courage at a time. There is a moment of awakening that arrives quietly, almost like a whisper, when a person begins to understand that their worth was never something to be handed out for others to measure. It was never meant to be weighed by opinions, compared through expectations, or reduced to approval. Those who cannot be controlled have come to know this truth deeply. They have walked through seasons where they questioned themselves, where they looked outward for validation, hoping to find in others what could only be discovered within. And through that journey, they learned something unshakable, that their value does not increase with praise, nor does it diminish with criticism. They no longer stand in front of the world asking, "Am I enough?" because they have already answered that question for themselves. And once that answer settles into the soul, something changes forever. They begin to move differently, not out of pride, but out of quiet certainty. They stop bending themselves to fit into spaces that require them to shrink. They stop chasing acceptance from those who cannot see them clearly. Instead, they stand in their truth, even when it means standing alone. There is a calm strength in a person who knows their worth. It shows in the way they no longer tolerate disrespect disguised as honesty, or neglect disguised as busyness. They do not cling to relationships that require them to prove their value over and over again. They understand that love, respect, and recognition should flow naturally, not be forced or begged for. And when those things are absent, they do not argue or chase. They simply step back. Not because they feel superior, but because they refuse to stay where they are not valued. This kind of self-worth does not come from a place of perfection. It is not built on always getting things right or always being strong. In fact, it often grows from the opposite, from failure, from heartbreak, from moments of deep doubt. But instead of allowing those experiences to define them, they use them as lessons. They begin to see themselves with compassion rather than criticism. They learn to forgive their own mistakes, to honor their own growth, and to recognize that being human does not make them less worthy, it makes them real. And because they hold this understanding so firmly, they cannot be easily controlled. You cannot manipulate someone who does not rely on your approval to feel whole. You cannot diminish someone who has already faced their own insecurities and made peace with them. Their sense of self is not fragile because it is not built on shifting ground. It is rooted deeply beyond the reach of passing judgments or temporary opinions. So they walk through the world with a quiet dignity, not needing to announce their value, because it is already reflected in how they live, in the way they choose themselves without guilt, in the way they walk away without bitterness, and in the way they remain grounded even when the world tries to shake them. Their self-worth is not loud, but it is unwavering. And in that unwavering truth, they become something the world cannot easily influence, because they have already claimed what was always theirs. There is a quiet freedom that reveals itself when a person no longer wakes each day asking the world for permission to be who they are. It is not a loud rebellion, nor a sudden transformation, but a gentle release, a letting go of the need to be approved, applauded, or accepted by every passing voice. Those who cannot be controlled have stepped into this freedom. They have learned that a life built on approval is a life that can be easily shaped by others, bent by opinions, and broken by rejection. And so, they choose a different path, one guided not by validation, but by purpose. They understand how easy it is to become lost in the expectations of others, to dress a certain way, speak a certain way, live a certain way, not because it feels true, but because it feels accepted. And for a time, they may have walked that road, adjusting themselves to fit into spaces that were never meant for them. But somewhere along the way, they realized the cost of that adjustment. They felt the quiet exhaustion of pretending, the slow fading of their own voice beneath the noise of what others wanted them to be. And in that realization, they made a choice to return to themselves. This return is not always comfortable. It asks them to stand in their truth even when it is misunderstood. It asks them to follow a path that may not be praised or even recognized, but they no longer measure their direction by applause. They measure it by alignment, by whether their actions reflect who they truly are, not who they are expected to be. And in that alignment, they find a deeper kind of fulfillment, one that does not depend on how many people agree with them, but on how honestly they are living. You will notice that they do not constantly look around to see who is watching, who is approving, who is nodding in agreement. They move with a quiet focus, guided by something internal and steady. When they make decisions, it is not to impress, but to express, not to gain acceptance, but to honor truth. And because of this, they are not easily swayed. Praise does not inflate them, and criticism does not define them. They listen, they consider, but they do not lose themselves in the process. There is a strength in this kind of independence that unsettles those who rely on control, because control often depends on approval, the promise of it, or the withdrawal of it. But when a person no longer seeks validation, that leverage disappears. You cannot guide them with praise, nor silence them with disapproval. They are anchored in something far deeper than external opinion. Their direction is not dictated by what is popular, but by what is meaningful. And so they walk their path with a quiet confidence. Even when it is lonely, even when it is uncertain, they trust themselves enough to keep going, even without applause. They believe in their purpose enough to continue, even without recognition. And in that belief, they become unshakable, not because the world has accepted them, but because they have accepted themselves. There is a quiet discipline in those who have learned to listen more than they speak, a discipline that often goes unnoticed in a world that celebrates the loudest voice in the room. While others rush to be heard, to prove, to interrupt, these individuals lean into stillness. They understand that there is a certain power in restraint, a certain wisdom in allowing others to reveal themselves fully. For when a person speaks without pause, they often give away more than they intend, their thoughts, their motives, their insecurities. And those who are patient enough to listen begin to see clearly what noise would have hidden. They do not listen merely to respond, they listen to understand. There is a difference, and it shapes everything. In their silence, they are not empty, they are attentive. They observe the tone behind the words, the pauses between sentences, the emotions that linger beneath what is being said. They notice what others overlook. And in that awareness, they gather insight that cannot be gained through constant speaking. It is not that they have nothing to say, it is that they have learned that words carry more weight when they are chosen carefully, not scattered carelessly. This way of being creates a quiet advantage. While others may reveal their plans too soon or react too quickly, these individuals remain grounded. They are not easily pulled into confusion or misdirection because they take the time to see the full picture. They understand that truth often unfolds slowly, and those who rush to conclusions often miss it entirely. So they wait, they watch, and when they finally speak, their words carry clarity, not clutter. There is also a deep respect in the way they listen. In a world where many people are waiting for their turn to talk, they offer something rare, the feeling of being truly heard. And yet, even in that openness, they do not lose themselves. They do not absorb every opinion as truth, nor do they allow every voice to shape their thinking. They filter what they hear through their own understanding, keeping what aligns and releasing what does not. Their listening is active, but it is also discerning. You will notice that they are not easily provoked into unnecessary conversation. They do not argue for the sake of winning, nor do they speak just to fill silence. They understand that silence itself can be a form of communication, one that expresses patience, control, and confidence. And because they are comfortable in that silence, they are not pressured to break it for the comfort of others. This often unsettles those who rely on constant dialogue to maintain control, because without words to engage, there is nothing to manipulate. And so, they move through conversations with intention. They allow others to speak freely, to reveal, to express, while they remain centered and aware. Their silence becomes a space where truth surfaces, where understanding deepens, and where control loses its grip. For when you listen more than you speak, you begin to see the world not just as it is presented, but as it truly is. And in that seeing, you gain a quiet strength, one that cannot be easily deceived, and certainly cannot be easily controlled. There is a quiet courage in choosing peace in a world that constantly tempts you with approval. It is not always easy to turn away from the comfort of being liked, from the warmth of acceptance, from the familiar pull of fitting in. But those who cannot be controlled have learned that popularity is often a fragile thing. It shifts with opinions, it bends with trends, and it disappears the moment you stop becoming what others expect. Peace, on the other hand, is steady. It does not ask you to perform, nor does it require you to betray yourself to maintain it. They have come to understand that trying to be liked by everyone is a silent exhaustion. It asks you to edit your truth, to soften your boundaries, to smile when something within you feels misaligned, and over time, that constant adjustment begins to feel heavy. It creates a life where you are present, but not fully yourself. So they make a different choice. They release the need to be understood by all, and instead they focus on being honest with themselves. And in that honesty, they find a peace that no amount of approval could ever replace. This does not mean they reject people or push the world away. It simply means they no longer shape themselves to fit into every space. They accept that not everyone will agree with them, not everyone will like them, and not everyone is meant to stay. And rather than resisting this truth, they embrace it, because they know that being liked by everyone often comes at the cost of being real with yourself. And they are no longer willing to pay that price. There is a stillness in the way they move through life, a grounded calm that does not seek attention. They do not chase validation through constant agreement, nor do they fear disapproval enough to silence their voice. When they speak, it is from a place of truth, not from a desire to be accepted. And when they choose silence, it is not out of insecurity, but out of clarity. They understand that peace is not found in managing how others see you, but in aligning with who you truly are. You will notice that they do not engage in every opportunity to be seen or liked. They are not drawn to every crowd, nor do they feel the need to impress every room they enter. Instead, they protect their energy. They choose environments that feel genuine, connections that feel mutual, and paths that feel right, even if they are not the most popular. This kind of discernment allows them to remain steady, unaffected by the constant shifting of external approval. And because of this, they cannot be easily controlled. For control often hides behind the desire to be liked, the pressure to conform, the fear of rejection, the need to belong at any cost. But when a person chooses peace over popularity, that pressure loses its hold. They are no longer moved by the opinions of the crowd, nor are they guided by the need to please. They stand firmly in their own space, calm and certain, even when it sets them apart. In the end, they walk a path that may not always be understood, but it is deeply their own. And in choosing peace again and again, they build a life that is not loud with approval, but rich with authenticity. A life where they can rest in themselves fully, without the weight of pretending. And in that quiet, unwavering peace, they become free in a way that no popularity could ever offer. There is a sacred kind of healing that does not ask to be witnessed. It does not announce itself with explanations, nor does it seek comfort in the approval of others. Those who cannot be controlled understand this deeply. When they are broken, they do not rush to the world to perform their pain. When they are wounded, they do not turn their suffering into something for display. Instead, they retreat into the quiet spaces of their own being, where no judgment interrupts and no opinion distorts what they are truly going through. In those private moments, they face themselves honestly. They sit with their grief without distraction. They acknowledge their failures without excuse, and they allow their emotions to move through them without shame. It is not an easy process. Healing rarely is. There are days when silence feels heavier than words, when memories rise like waves, and when the weight of everything unspoken becomes almost too much to carry. But they do not run from it. They stay, they endure, and slowly, piece by piece, they begin to rebuild what life has shaken. There is a quiet dignity in choosing to heal away from the eyes of the world. It is the understanding that not every scar needs an audience, and not every recovery needs validation. They learn to comfort themselves in ways that others cannot. They learn to speak gently to their own wounds, to forgive themselves for moments they cannot change, and to release what they cannot control. In this solitude, they are not abandoned, they are being rebuilt. And while the world sees nothing, something profound is happening beneath the surface. Strength is returning where weakness once lived. Clarity is forming where confusion once lingered. Peace is slowly replacing the noise of internal conflict. It is a transformation that cannot be rushed and it cannot be forced. It unfolds in its own time, quietly, steadily, almost invisibly. But it is real, and it is powerful. Then comes the moment when they step back into the world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a presence that feels different. They do not need to announce what they have survived. They do not need to explain what they have endured. It is written in the calmness of their voice, in the steadiness of their gaze, in the quiet confidence of someone who has met themselves in the dark and learned not to turn away. People may not always know what changed, but they feel it. There is a strength in them that does not demand attention, yet cannot be ignored. It is the strength of someone who has been broken and did not stay broken. Someone who has been lost and still found their way back. Someone who has faced silence and did not fear it. And this is what makes them difficult to control. For control depends on weakness that is visible, on pain that is exposed, on wounds that can be influenced. But when healing happens in private, what emerges in public is not fragility, but quiet resilience. They are no longer easily shaken by judgment, no longer easily moved by pressure, no longer easily defined by others. They rise, not to prove anything, but because they have already done the deeper work within themselves. And in that rising, without noise or need for approval, they become something unshakable, whole in their own way, steady in their own truth, and free in a way the world rarely understands, but always feels.